The Whispers of Sheikhupura Fort. A haunted story from Punjab, Pakistan. There are places in Pakistan where history feels alive. Places where old walls seem to remember the people who once walked through them. And then there are places where history feels like something darker. Sheikhupura Fort is one of those places. Standing roughly 35 to 36 kilometers northwest of Lahore, the massive old fort has watched centuries pass before its weathered walls. Its story reaches back to the Mughal era, when Emperor Jahangir used the surrounding region as a royal hunting ground. Historical accounts connect the beginning of the fort's construction to the early years of Jahangir's reign. Today, however, the fort is a very different place. Its grand rooms have fallen silent. Its walls are damaged. Its corridors are empty. And after sunset, according to local stories, there are sounds inside the fort that nobody can easily explain. Whispers. Footsteps. Crying. And sometimes, the sound of someone walking directly behind you. But the strangest part of the legend is not the footsteps. It is the story of the woman who is said to still be waiting inside. The fort that remembered too much. Long before Sheikhupura became the modern city it is today, this region was associated with Mughal royal hunting grounds. Emperor Jahangir was fascinated by the area. The forests were rich with wildlife, and the emperor frequently visited the region for hunting. Historical records describe Jahangir's connection with the area and his orders for construction there. The fort eventually became part of a landscape associated with royal retreats, hunting, and imperial power. Imagine the fort centuries ago. Oil lamps burning against enormous walls. Guards standing beside the entrance. Horses moving through the courtyard. Royal servants carrying messages. Nobles whispering behind closed doors. And inside the women's quarters. Women of the royal household living lives hidden from the outside world. For generations, rulers came and went. The Mughal period faded. The Sikh period followed. Later came British rule. The fort witnessed political struggles, changes of power, imprisonment, royal families, and countless ordinary servants whose names were never recorded. The walls remained. The people disappeared. But according to local legend, not everyone left. The queen who never left. Among the stories surrounding Sheikhupura Fort is a particularly disturbing legend. Locals have long spoken about royal women and past residents whose lives were connected with the fort. Some versions of the story describe the spirit of a queen. Others speak of a royal woman who died after experiencing terrible suffering. And some simply say that the fort became a resting place for people who died there and never found peace. There is no reliable historical evidence proving that a particular queen haunts the fort. But the legend became stronger with every generation. Older residents reportedly warned younger people not to approach the fort after dark. They said the fort was different at night. During the day, it was simply an old historical building. At night, it belonged to something else. One elderly resident interviewed by the media described the stories passed down by previous generations and said people believed restless souls of queens, princesses, rulers and their servants remained there. Most people laughed at such stories. Until they heard something themselves. The Night Watchman. This story begins with a man whose name has never become famous. For this narration, we'll call him Rashid. Rashid had worked around old buildings for years. He wasn't the kind of man who believed every ghost story. He had worked in abandoned buildings. He had spent nights alone. He knew that old structures made strange noises. Wood expanded. Metal contracted. Birds nested in dark corners. Bats flew through broken windows. Wind moved through cracks in walls. Rashid had explanations for everything. Or at least, he thought he did. One evening, he was near Sheikhupura Fort after sunset. The sky was turning black. The last orange light was disappearing behind the horizon. The fort stood ahead of him like a giant shadow. There was almost no movement around it. No voices. No laughter. No traffic inside the old grounds. Only wind. Rashid heard something. Tap. 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 He stopped walking. The sound stopped too. He waited. Nothing. Then again. Tap. 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 It sounded like footsteps. Coming from inside the fort. Rashid stared toward the dark entrance. He told himself it was an animal. Perhaps a cat. Perhaps someone moving around inside. He took a few steps closer. The sound stopped. Then he heard a whisper. Very faint. So faint that he wasn't sure he had heard anything at all. He leaned forward. What? Silence. Then the whisper came again. This time, it sounded like a woman's voice. Rashid couldn't understand the words. But he could hear one thing clearly. She sounded frightened. The first step inside. Rashid should have walked away. Instead, curiosity defeated fear. He moved closer to the old structure. The entrance looked enormous in the darkness. He switched on his flashlight. The beam crossed the walls. Broken brick. Ancient plaster. Dark openings. And then something moved. Rashid immediately pointed the flashlight toward it. Nothing. Only an empty corridor. He laughed nervously. Probably a bat. He stepped inside. The temperature changed almost immediately. Outside, the night air was warm. Inside, it was cold. Not ordinary nighttime cold. It was the kind of cold that seemed to touch the skin suddenly. Rashid rubbed his arms. Then he heard footsteps. Behind him. One step. Then another. He turned. Nothing. His flashlight swept across the corridor. Empty. He continued walking. Step. 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 Then another sound came from behind. Rashid froze. The footsteps had stopped. He waited. Nothing. He turned around again. Still nothing. Then he heard a woman's voice. This time. Much closer. Don't. Rashid's heart began pounding. He couldn't understand whether the voice had said anything else. He raised the flashlight. The corridor remained empty. But there was something strange on the floor. A trail of dust had been disturbed. As if someone had just walked across it. Rashid stared at the marks. The footprints appeared to begin several meters behind him. And they ended. Directly beside his own feet. The running. That was enough. Rashid turned and ran. He didn't look behind him. He rushed through the corridor toward the entrance. Behind him came the sound of footsteps. Fast footsteps. Someone was running after him. Rashid ran harder. The footsteps became louder. Closer. He could hear them clearly now. Bang. 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 He reached the entrance. Then suddenly. Silence. Rashid stopped. He looked behind him. Nothing. The corridor was empty. Completely empty. He stepped outside. The warm night air hit his face. For several seconds he simply stood there. Then he heard something from inside the fort. A woman's voice. Clearer than before. Why did you leave me? Rashid never entered the fort alone again. The story of the workers. But Rashid's story is not the only tale connected with Sheikhupura Fort. The fort has suffered decades of deterioration, and restoration efforts have repeatedly faced difficulties. Historical documentation records the fort as being in a progressive state of decay when it came under archaeological protection, while later reports described stalled restoration projects. And this is where another part of the legend begins. People began saying that workers didn't want to stay there after dark. Some allegedly complained about hearing voices. Others claimed they felt as if someone was watching them. A worker would hear footsteps from an empty room. Another would hear something falling. Someone would turn around after feeling a hand near their shoulder, only to discover nobody standing there. Whether these incidents were supernatural or simply the result of working inside a damaged, centuries-old structure is impossible to prove. But fear doesn't need proof. It only needs a story. And Sheikhupura had plenty of stories. The Crying Woman. One of the most disturbing legends says that the sound of a woman crying can sometimes be heard inside the fort. Not screaming. Not shouting. Crying. A low, broken sound. The kind of crying that seems to come from someone who has been waiting for a very long time. According to the legend, the sound becomes louder when someone tries to find its source. You hear it from one room. You walk toward it. It becomes quieter. Then you hear it behind you. You turn around. Nothing. You walk back. And suddenly, the crying comes from the room you just left. It is almost as if the fort itself is moving the sound, leading you deeper. The 3 footsteps. There is another detail found in stories about old buildings like Sheikhupura Fort. A person walks through an empty corridor. Then hears footsteps behind them. They stop. The footsteps stop. They walk again. The footsteps follow. But there is something strange. The footsteps never pass them. They always remain exactly 3 or 4 steps behind. 1, 2, 3. Stop. Then the person walks. 1, 2, 3. Stop. It feels like someone is following. But when they turn around, there is nobody there. Local stories around Sheikhupura Fort include reports of unexplained footsteps and a feeling of being followed, particularly after dark. And perhaps that is why the legend became so powerful. Because being followed by something you cannot see is far more terrifying than seeing a ghost. The shadow on the wall. One night, according to another local style account, a visitor stood outside the fort and noticed a shadow moving across an interior wall. At first, he thought it was another person. The shadow looked human. Tall. Thin. Slowly walking. He watched it move from one side of the wall to the other. Then he realized something. There was no person standing between the light and the wall. The shadow continued moving. Then stopped. It turned. And appeared to face him. The visitor ran. Behind him, he heard something strike the wall. Once. Twice. 3 times. He never went back. What is really inside? But here is where the story becomes more interesting. Because not everything strange in Sheikhupura Fort has to be supernatural. The building is centuries old. Its walls have been damaged. Some areas are unsafe. Birds and bats can inhabit abandoned rooms. Wind can move through cracks and openings. Loose bricks can fall. Old wood can creak. Echoes can travel through empty corridors in unexpected ways. And the human brain behaves differently when we are afraid. A small noise becomes a footstep. A shadow becomes a person. A cold breeze becomes the touch of an invisible hand. That is exactly why the official explanation matters. A former Punjab archaeology official, Afzal Khan, rejected the idea that the fort was haunted and described the ghost stories as fictitious. Another archaeology official explained that public access restrictions were related to the fort's dilapidated condition, not paranormal activity. So, is Sheikhupura Fort actually haunted? Nobody can prove it. But that doesn't make the stories disappear. The woman at the window. Now comes the final story. The story that has made people uncomfortable for generations. A man was reportedly passing near the fort late at night. He looked toward one of the upper levels. There was a woman standing at a window. She was dressed in white. Her face was difficult to see. The man assumed she was simply someone inside the fort. Then he noticed something strange. She wasn't moving. Not even slightly. The man continued walking. After several seconds, he looked back. The woman was still there. Same position. Same posture. Same direction. He walked farther. Then looked again. She had disappeared. He thought that was the end. Until he heard a voice behind him. Wait. He turned. Nobody. Then another whisper. Please. Still nobody. He ran. The next morning, he returned to the place with other people. They looked toward the window. There was no woman. Only an empty opening in the ancient wall. The last visit. Years later, a group of curious young men decided they wanted to see the fort at night. They had heard all the stories. The Queen. The whispers. The footsteps. The crying. They didn't believe any of it. They wanted proof. One of them carried a camera. Another carried a flashlight. They entered the area after dark. At first, nothing happened. They laughed. They joked about the ghost stories. One of them even shouted into the darkness. If you're here, show yourself. Nothing. Then the camera recorded something. A sound. Very faint. Almost buried beneath the wind. A woman's voice. The group stopped laughing. They replayed the recording. Again. And again. The voice was difficult to understand. But one phrase seemed clear. Go away. They immediately left. Later, they listened to the recording again. This time they noticed something else. Behind the woman's voice, there was another sound. Footsteps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then silence. The strange part. The footsteps appeared to be moving toward the microphone. Not away from it. The fort still stands. Today, Sheikhupura Fort remains an important historical monument, despite its deteriorated condition. Government and archaeological sources document its Mughal origins and later Sikh period alterations. The walls have survived emperors. They survived political revolutions. They survived changing rulers. They survived wars. And they survived the disappearance of the people who once called them home. But perhaps that is why the fort feels different. Because when a building survives for 400 years, it becomes a witness. It sees everything. Births. Deaths. Love. Betrayal. Power. Prisoners. Queens. Servants. Soldiers. And ordinary people whose names history forgot. Maybe the whispers are nothing more than wind. Maybe the footsteps belong to animals. Maybe the shadows are tricks of light. Maybe every cold spot has a scientific explanation. Or maybe some stories refuse to die. The final whisper. There is one question that remains. If Sheikhupura Fort is only an abandoned historical building, why do so many people describe the same feeling? The feeling that someone is standing behind them. The feeling that they are being watched. The feeling that the darkness isn't empty. Perhaps it is simply the power of suggestion. Perhaps centuries of stories have transformed the fort into a place where fear creates its own reality. Or perhaps The people who believe in the legend are right. Perhaps someone really is still walking through those ancient corridors. Perhaps the woman at the window is still waiting. Perhaps the footsteps are still following whoever walks alone. And perhaps, if you ever stand outside Sheikhupura Fort after midnight and hear a woman's voice whisper your name, you should not turn around. Because according to the legend, the first time you hear the footsteps, they are behind you. But the second time, they are standing beside you. And if you hear a third set of footsteps running toward you, don't look. Just run. Because the old fort may be empty. But according to those who believe its darkest stories, something inside it may still be waiting. And perhaps the most terrifying thing about Sheikhupura Fort isn't that ghosts might exist there. It's that after for centuries, we still don't know everything that happened behind those walls. Some ruins preserve history. Others preserve secrets. And Sheikhupura Fort may be preserving both.